Hello everyone, my name is Ephraim Katsir, and on behalf of Sephardic Heritage International in DC, or SHIN-DC, we welcome you to our Maqam of the Week webinar series with Syrian Jewish vocalist, Udist, and teacher Asher Shasho-Levy, who will now begin class number 4, Maqam Nahwand.
Thank you, Ephraim. I'll do a little taqsim Nahwand to give us a little feeling for the maqam of the day. Okay, so there we go. That's a little flavor of Nahwand. That's really a maqam that I love, and it's one that if I needed to play a taqsim, there are many instances in which you need to play a taqsim for over 20 minutes. If you're at if you're at a hafla, if you're just killing time at a wedding or something like that, and you need to create an atmosphere. Nahwand is a really wonderful maqam because, first of all, it can be harmonized in a Western context. So there's a lot to be said about Nahwand. On one hand, it is one of the most Western of the maqamat. It's a very easy maqam for Western musicians to be able to play, and so there's a lot of repertoire for it. There's a lot of songs that have been composed in the 20th century. And in the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years, there's been a lot of repertoire in the sort of Jerusalem Sephardic and also general, more Israeli Mizrahi popular style that has been written in this maqam Nahwand. It is very easy to transition from maqam Nahwand to many other maqamat, which makes it a very flexible maqam. Yes, someone points out that it is Nahwand in Turkish. Exactly. It has this maqam is ultimately. Isaac asks, is there a file that we can follow along with? Yes, Ephraim, if you don't mind sharing the sayr of the maqam, that will show everyone the ajnas so that we can all follow along. Yeah, so Nahwand is this. It's the same, but it's also different because it's. I'm not an expert on the Turkish makamlar, but I understand that Nahwand the root note is it G maybe? I think it may be G. It's not on C. So whereas part of what makes Nahwand is having it be on C. When I learned Nahwand, I also learned that if it's on D, I transpose many tunes in Nahwand to D, so don't feel bad about doing it. But I learned that if you transpose it up a whole step, it becomes busalik. which is the same notes, but it's ultimately it's different. Maybe someone who knows more about Turkish makamlar.
Well, may I say something?
Please do.
D is something that we change in Turkish with T, like the name Levant in Ottoman became
Right.
Levant as a name,
Right.
or like many things finish with D become with as T in Turkish. So that's why I think Nihab, because when I search now in Turkish like art music, they call it Nihavand with D.
Right.
It doesn't have any difference. I think it's just the same. Like it's about Arabic and Turkish language different. Like in
Right.
Arabic it's like kitab, book. In Turkish it's kitap.
Exactly.
I think.
Exactly. You're 100% right. And then the other difference that I was pointing out is I think that in Turkish music, the root notes of the makamlar are different. So, and this is not something that I'm an expert in. I can look into this, and anyone can look into this if they're interested. But I believe that nihaven starts on a different tonic note than the Arabic nahawand.
Okay.
It may be A, it may be G, but I know it's not C. In the same way that the Turkish rast starts on a different note than the Arabic rast. But the scale degrees are the same. It's the same.
Persian one too. It's
yeah.
super complicated. There's a Persian maqam.
Exactly. The degrees are the same and the scales work in the same way basically, but by virtue of it being in a having a different tonic, it sounds different. Yeah. So let's see, Ephraim, if you can share the sire of the maqam, then we can. Yeah. So yeah, if everyone, this is a wonderful point. The way that we are learning the maqamat in this class is based on a certain Arabic tradition of the maqamat, which is the Aleppian Syrian Jewish tradition, which is a particular Arabic tradition that is older. And because it's older, it has prominent Turkish influence. Because the Halabi Jewish community was an Ottoman Jewish community, and so some of the maqamat that are featured in the Syrian Jewish community, like Sultani Yaga and Nakriz, are basically straight Turkish maqamlar that don't really have as much application in Arabic music anymore, which is worth noting, and I think will become more relevant as we work through. Yeah, I don't see the file.
Just give me I'm putting it up, getting it up there for you.
Okay, wonderful. So let's just start. The essence of Nahwand is always going to be Jins Nahwand. So we're going to start always on C. Unless you transpose it. I don't want to be too dogmatic about these things because you'll learn it on C, or you'll learn, another maqam, you'll learn bayat on D or whatever, and you'll learn it that way, but then you'll always conceive of it that way, but you may end up playing it in another key, but you'll still think of it on C, if that makes sense. Okay. Let me see. So the beginning of the scale is basically it's just minor. It's standard minor. We're talking in C, C, D, and then E flat. And you're going to typically have that half-step descent as you're starting it. And then up to F. That is Jins Nahwand. Is E flat a little sharp of equal temperament? No, it's basically. That's a good question. I don't think so though. Nahwand. Let me see, Ephraim, if you're not able to share the sire of the maqam.
It's not. So we'll have it up there in about 1 minute because there's a little technical difficulty on this end, but it should be up in 1 minute.
Okay, great. So we'll just continue working through it. So it should be in a minute on the screen share. And this is a maqam that I think can be learned quite easily. This one is not a challenging maqam. The thing that makes it not difficult, but the thing that makes it sound like what it is the way that you're going to ornament it and the way that you're going to stop along each step of the maqam. Okay, so Nahwand on C, C, D, E flat, F. That's the next step. So then you can think of, there are a number of ways to conceive of how the maqam continues. You can continue along, you can think of it as a second Nahwand on F. So that's one way that you can conceive of it. Another way to conceive of it is of E flat ajam, ajam being major. So let's see. See, there's no difference in the notes. It's exactly the same, but it's how you're dividing it, and both is correct and both is true, and different songs will divide it differently. So let me illustrate that once again. So this is going to be building Nahwand with an emphasis on C Nahwand up to F Nahwand. These are the jinsis. This is both maqam Nahwand. Ah, wonderful. Does everyone see that now?
Ajam, Hijaz.
Okay, great. So Nahwand on C. So if you can see the Nahwand on C, if you see the F in the first scale, the F can be thought of as leading to another Nahwand, effectively. That's a second Nahwand modulation. So you can emphasize that, or as the scale suggests, you can emphasize the ajam on E flat. So emphasizing the ajam on E flat will sound like this. Emphasizing the Nahwand on F will sound like this. So, just a different way to divide.
I have a question.
Please.
So I'm noticing, first of all, that on this sheet there's two different Nahwands, one which has a raised seventh and the other which doesn't.
Yes.
And I'm noticing that when you're playing the seventh below the one is not as raised, and the seventh above the one is not raised. Is that like a standard thing that the seventh below the one is the Hijaz 7 and the seventh above the one is the Qudrat 7, or?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
I noticed when you were playing
Yes.
in the sort of lower Nahwand register, you were using the Hijaz 7.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's standard.
But when you were going up in the higher parts, you would be more likely to use the Kurd. You're going.
Yes.
So is that sort of that standard? You use the people are more likely to use the Kurd when they're higher up and the Hijaz on the lower down.
In the way that I learned it, is how I find to be more standard. There are a few different variations on that. So in the bottom, I find that you have to use that that hijaz, because otherwise it doesn't sound like Nahwand. You're setting it up to basically be something else. You're setting it up. That's different. You can do that, but you kind of want to resolve it. You can do that. But it seems that to me that's the sound of Nahwand. The Kurd has more of an independent grounding in a different maqam family, if that makes sense. Up top, I always tend to want to go to that to the Kurd because it has more of a this is going to be very abstract, but it has more of a yearning sound to me, and it has more of a reaching. And look, the way that I formulate my Nahwand is based on a particular Nahwand that I learned from Hazan Haim Mizrahi. He's a Turkish cantor here in Los Angeles, who I learned with for my bar mitzvah. And he would pray Nahwand every Shabbat Shahri. So I heard a lot of Nahwand. And this is basically his Nahwand. And his Nahwand would basically tend to, and then it would have the hijaz up there. So for me, that to me is the most elemental Nahwand that I learned. I don't know if that's a super clear answer, but again, I never studied this in a like a conservatory of Arabic music or maqamat. I learned this from people in the community. So what I consider to be the most traditional or classic is only going to be true of the maqamat of Syrian Jews and the sort of Ottoman classical traditions of Turkish Hazan.
So that brings me to another question, which is, what distinguishes this from Western Minor?
A few things. In terms of the ornamentation, I would say, in Western Minor, you'll never have, okay, it's going to get more, the distinctions come more in terms of when we hear the songs and we hear how it's used in the Pizmonim. Something very common to have in Nahwand that you would never hear in Western Minor is this. There are certain hijaz modulations to hijaz rast that would be impossible in Western Minor. So if you had a bayat up on top would be common. Something like that. That you couldn't really have in Western Minor. Modulations to rast happen in Nahwand sometimes. Nahwand itself is minor, but and more to your point, Nahwand was not part of the cycle of the maqam of the week until the 20th century. It is a new maqam. It is a maqam that has more of its roots in Western music, to the extent that the pizmon that is chosen for the pizmon of the week in the Syrian Hazanut survey this week, I believe the melody comes from Chopin. Okay, so this is the maqam that is most rooted in Western music to an extent.
I did notice that on the Sephardic Pizmonim project, or sorry, it lists Yerushalayim Shel Zahav under the Nahwand Pizmonim, which was surprising to me because like it has a raised third.
So we'll look, something that we'll learn as we go through is that the maqamat classification is not, it's not so strict. Like the first, as we get into today's pizmon is the famous, it's not actually today's pizmon. Today's pizmon, if you look in the Hazanut survey, is Ahzeh ben Noam, which has a melody from Chopin, which is kind of cool, but that's not exactly what I want to be doing in this class. So I chose Agadelcha Elohei Kol Neshama, the 20th century Yerushalmi melody written by Mordechai Chalfon, which is a gorgeous melody. One of the most famous melodies in Maqam Nahwand, except the first piece of melody, the first genes that we hear in the Pismon is not Nahwand at all. So that will go to show that you can have a piece of music that starts in with a phrase of a certain maqam, or has elements of other maqamat, many transpositions, but as long as it's grounded in a maqam, it can still be classified as that. So that goes
Thanks.
to your point with Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. There can be transpositions, but as long as it is grounded in the maqam, that will be how it is classified.
And taksim means like sometimes distribution, and also like in here we mean it like the passage, because in order to distribute from one maqam to another, you need to pass. That's
Exactly.
why maybe we call it as taksim, because there is a center in Istanbul which called Taksim, and Taksim means to distribute, because the water has been distributed from that center, like Istanbul. That's why it is called.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's an exercise, actually. It's not an exercise. It's a passage from Tehillim, but it is in a way an exercise that Hazanim, in order to become expert in the Syrian tradition, have to do, which is to chant Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, every verse in a different maqam, and to cycle through all of the maqamat and transition between them verse to verse. It's incredibly difficult. I can't do it. You know, this is not something that is, you know, and I'm a teacher of this tradition, and I'm an oud player, and I know the maqamat, but to be able to go one verse to the next and transition from one to the other, that's, yes, I'll send that out. I will make sure that everyone gets that. That's the stuff that's really a high level. And that's why you learn the transitions between the maqamat and how they interact with each other. And that's why you learn where, you know, they sort of connect and how to put them together. So with the Nahwand, that's why you have to know where to use the chord, where to use the hijaz, and where the ajam comes into play. And also, actually, this is a fairly straightforward maqam, so I think it's we can move on unless anyone has any questions. I'm going to actually, before we move on, I'll just give a few substitutions that are worth noting. So Nahwand. So kurd on G is a substitution, but another substitution is bayat on G. So bayat being minor, but with a neutral second, meaning a half-flatted second. That's a transition that you'll hear oftentimes in many songs. So from the Nahwand. Because bayat and kurd are only separated by a quarter flat in the second degree. So in the same way that you'll have a kurd modulation, you can have a bayat modulation. But the main point is that Nahwand itself is jins Nahwand. That's the main point. Before we move on to the Pismon, why Maqam Nahwand today? Why for this perasha? There is a notion in our tradition that this maqam is a maqam of conflict. For various reasons, this maqam symbolizes conflict in the Syrian Jewish tradition. And the perasha this week is one of conflict. It's perashat Korah. And we have all of the conflict between Korah and the various instigators in the community, Datan, Abiram, who rise up. And so the teachers in the tradition said that at a certain point that this maqam would be the one for this Shabbat. That being said, this was not always the maqam of the week, and in many places in the Syrian and Eastern Sephardic world that follow a maqam schedule, this is not the maqam this week. So I understand that Hosseini is the maqam in many places this week, and that is an older tradition. We will be working through the Hosseini, maqam Hosseini next week. So we lose nothing in terms of that, that conflict between the different sources. And as Rabbi Abadi, who joined us last week, mentioned, there's a Syrian custom that, that no other community follows, actually, to join, to connect the perashiot of Korah and Hukat instead of joining Hukat and Balak. Why? That way, we're not assigning too much emphasis on the reading Zot Hukat Torah for Perashat Hukat. That this is the decree of the Torah. So that's a unique custom, and that also affected what the maqam of the week is. So in Argentina and in Mexico, where that custom is still followed, the maqam this week would be Hosseini. And so next week, where Parashat Hukat is going to be read, then we'll do Hosseini. So we're going to move on now, unless anyone has any questions. I think this is a fairly straightforward maqam this week, but one of the most beautiful, I think. Absolutely a beautiful maqam for the leading of tefillah, very accessible. You'll hear a lot of people leading the tefillah in this maqam because of the incredible wealth of tunes in Maqam Nahwand from throughout the Sephardic diaspora, whether it be Ladino romanzas or popular Maghrebi songs like, you know, Bin el bara hawliyum for Kiyesh Mera Shabbat, or whatever settings you're going to put it in the tefillah. Tons of Maghrebi songs, and then throughout the Levant you'll have lots of songs in Maqam Nahwand. So there's no, it's not like with Siga and Saba where you'll have people, you know, struggling to find songs and pizmonim to fit to the liturgy. On a Shabbat Nahwand, everyone's a Hazan, everyone wants to lead because everyone knows all of these songs for it. So without further ado, Ephraim, if you don't mind sharing today's pizmon, which is actually not a pizmon, it's a bakasha. If we're gonna be precise, Agadelcha Elohe Kol Neshama. We're doing some old stuff today. We're going back to the source, because a lot of what we've been doing lately has been pizmonim from a 19th century repertoire, from 20th century repertoire. But what we're doing today is from the 13th century, I believe. This is from Abraham ibn Ezra, and it comes from the cycle of the Bakashot, which in the winter months, from Simchat Torah through Purim, you know, in the dead of night, as it were, people in Sephardic communities gather together to sing this cycle of the Bakashot. You may notice that it says Siga on the top. Why are we doing this today if it's in Siga and this is the Nahwand week? Well, there actually are melodies for Agadelcha Elohe Kol Neshama in pretty much every maqam, and it would be cycled through depending on what week you were in. The melody that we're going to do is a melody that has basically overtaken all of the other melodies for Agadelcha. There are many other beautiful melodies, but this melody has reigned supreme, so to speak. Many people think this is a traditional melody. I thought this was a traditional melody most of my life until I did a little bit of research and found out that this melody was written sometime in the middle of the 20th century by Mordechai Chalfon, who was a tremendous talent. He was an Udist, he was a Hazan, he was a master of the Yerushalmi liturgy, and he wrote many compositions in the Jerusalem Sephardic style. He trained as a Hazan with Al-Ghazi Effendi, and many of the actually Turkish Ottoman Hazanim who came to Jerusalem. There's a lot of very interesting stuff about this guy, and I can send out a YouTube channel that's been put up by, I believe, members of his family that have home recordings of him leading, tefillah for Yamim Noraim and Shabbat and things like that, accompanying himself on the oud. It's really tremendous. I'm still looking for a recording of him performing Abadilcha Elohei Kol Neshama, his most famous composition. That's one thing I can't find. But this has really, you can scarcely go anywhere in the world and, at a Sephardic house or Shabbat table or synagogue. And, this is just one of those songs that everyone knows. And it really, to me, this melody really expresses the full range of emotion of the poetry. So it's one of those really beautiful marriages of text and music. So I was saying earlier that this is a true Nahwand, but it actually begins not in the Maqam. What do I mean? It begins with a related Maqam, or rather a related genes called Nawa Atar. Okay, so Nawa Atar, if you were to go through the whole Maqam, which I can do briefly, starts with Nahwand actually, and then that's the difference. That's Nawa Atar. And there's a related maqam for the descent, which has chord called Nikriz. But yeah, so it starts with that really beautiful phrase with the Nawa Atar. And then descends down and grounds us in the Nahwand. Elohei kol neshama ve'odecha berov b'chad ve'ema. And then we're firmly in the Nahwand there with the F. That's how we know we're in Nahwand. The beginning phrase gives us a taste of the Nawa Atar, but it's firmly Nahwand. Next part. So that's the first part. I'll do that one more time. This is the second part. يصدق يصدق قلبي اللي بيهرس يصدق يصدق قلبي اللي So that second part really lingers on the upper genes of Hijaz to lengthen the feeling of longing and to give us a little bit of that feeling of the Hijaz that we spoke about, which can be, it can be sadness, it can be longing, it can be many different things, but this really is a beautiful melody that really, if you hear some of the other melodies for Agadelcha, they don't really capture all of the peaks and the valleys and the depths and the intensity of the expression of the poetry, in my opinion, though they are not to be ignored. There is a tendency sometimes when a melody becomes so popular, particularly some of these more modern Yerushalmi melodies, that they overwhelm some of the older melodies. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to learn this absolutely beautiful melody from Mordechai Khalfon. I forgot to mention, I don't want to Yerushalmi wash anyone. Mordechai Khalfon's family came from Tetouan in Morocco, from the Spanish Moroccan community there. And he came from the line of great Rabbanim. I'm forgetting the particular names, but there were many Rabbanim with the last name Khalfon. And what does Judith say? Tune of Una Pastora. Una Pastora is a little different, no? Una Pastora, is that Judith? You can unmute yourself if you'd like to contribute on Una Pastora.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, I'm sort of half here and half somewhere else, but that's what it sounded like quickly to me, at least that tune.
Are you're thinking of that one? Una Pastora.
Maybe I was thinking of another one because it's definitely one of the lyric songs.
Yeah, definitely. Well, those are all in Nahwand, and they all have the sort of same. Yeah.
I just put in a note not to call them romances because they're not. Like a romanza isn't a love song; it's actually a narrative ballad. So people started calling everything a romanza, like as if it were romantic. But that's not what it is. Like a romance or romanza is actually a song that tells a story, you know.
So the songs that I'm referring to.
They're love songs. They're lyric songs. They're canticas. They're canticas.
Much better.
And they're mostly pretty recent. Like they're mostly maybe 100, 120 years old.
Right.
So that for me is recent. I mean, they're not,
right.
hundreds of years old. Yeah.
I think
it was just gorgeous. I could listen to you forever.
I think we run into similar issues with the Ladino repertoire as we do with a lot of this Hebrew repertoire and Judeo-Arabic repertoire, with people tending to want to, assign it to a different period that it actually.
Yeah, well, there's also a big confusion, which is that in both cases, the words are very often old, but not the tune.
Right.
So, like when you say like a pismon or a piyut is from the 13th century, no, they didn't sing it that way in the 13th century. The words could be written in the 13th century or earlier, for that matter. They could be 12th century, but the tune isn't. And the same thing with these really old narrative ballads, like Landerico.
Right, exactly.
But no,
sorry.
So people get really mixed up by that, and they just say the whole song is, it's medieval, or it's this century, or it's that century. And it's funny because it doesn't even matter, like a great song is a great song. It doesn't matter if it's a great song from 10 years ago or 100 years ago. It's a great song. It's a terrific song.
Absolutely.
Yeah, actually, on that topic, I remember I was speaking with somebody who was going through the process of conversion, but they claimed to be a descendant of Anusim, and they said that the way they knew it was that growing up, their parents would teach them Ocho Candelitas.
That's
and
so funny.
Know how to mention them. That was written by Flori Jagoda in the 1970s.
I mean, that's hysterical. That's really
insane. I love that, though. It just it goes to show. It really goes to show. Yeah.
Although I met an 80-year-old at the time. He was 80 something, so now he'd be like 95. Rabbi in Bulgaria, and he said that Flori didn't make that up. That he grew up singing it. So I asked Flori about it. And she said, a lot of people say that. They all think that my songs are something they grew up singing. So go figure, It's a talent.
They say that that's the sign of a really wonderful composer, is if you...
Absolutely. Absolutely. If everybody thinks
If you
it's
can't imagine a world where their music didn't exist.
absolutely, and Flori knows that. She wasn't upset or anything, you know.
Right.
And no, it's the sign that you can really, really create songs that people feel are of the people, which is all a
Absolutely.
folk song is. It's a song that circulates among folk, you know.
And I think this melody of Agadelcha is a perfect example of
Absolutely.
that. I
I
mean,
was just going to get back to that. It's so accessible. You know, you can
Completely.
hum it, you can, yeah, and that's one of the charms of this whole repertoire is that they're beautiful and they're subtle and they're well composed, but they're accessible at the same time.
Right, and I think one of the beautiful things about this is a song that I've known for my whole life, and I lived for so many years believing that this was a folk song, and then in the past few years to be able to discover that no, this is actually something that was composed in the middle of the 20th century by someone that we know about.
Yeah, well, Quando Re Nimrod was composed in the, you know, fourth decade of the 20th century.
Really?
Decade of the 20th century?
Read Edwin Cerusi's article about it. He did all the work, all the research. I'm just the messenger.
I am going to be reaching out to you about
Yeah,
that.
sure, anytime.
That is amazing. So let's jump back into Agadelcha and let's make our way through the whole bakasha. It's the most beautiful when done all the way through, in my opinion, with all of the repeats. This is the way I learned it. I know a lot of people do different repeats or no repeats at all, but I'm teaching this class, so you're going to learn it my way. Does anybody have any questions before we jump in? Isaac says the melody for Shalom Aleichem. Something about
we were discussing songs which are not as old as people thought. And
oh yeah,
I was just mentioning that the melody that goes like Shalom Aleichem
Not that old.
was written at Columbia in the 20s.
Right.
On the Broward Library steps.
There's lots of examples of it, and it's good to sort of not expose, but to just give credit to the composers and not just sort of romanticize the folk song in a way that doesn't do anyone any credit. And particularly in the case with Sephardic music, where it creates this sort of false narrative of everything being medieval and everything being ancient and there being no modern repertoire. There's really a lot of damage that comes to that. Particularly,
for sure, we know that.
You know, there are so many amazing composers, and we have to give them credit. Mordechai Chalfon is just one. As we move through this class, and we go through all of these Pismonim and Bakashot, we're going to give credit to the people as we can who either wrote the melodies or the text. סוד יוצרו ומי הוא זה בכל קדמה בימה היוכל איש חקור את סוד יוצרו ומי הוא זה בכל קדמה בימה ברום המואלך ולשון אשר הפריק ועשה כל ועשה כל בחוכמה אשר הפריק ועשה כל ועשה כל בחוכמה ויתקדם במוי קדוש בעליון ויתקדם במוי קדוש ועליון ויתקדש שמחרב بالماء ויתקדש שמחרב بالماء. Okay, so that's Agadelcha as I play it with the repeats. Does anybody have any questions about the structure or about any of the parts or anything really?
Well, I don't know the time. I want just to add something, like, as far as I know, even the Los Bilbilicos music is like came from a maqam of a music, then like maqam of a prayer that then become written some words and then become a music. I guess I've heard.
For Los Bilbilicos?
Yeah, you know that song? No?
Yeah, of course. I'm not sure the origins of
Martin Schwartz in San Francisco says that it's one of the very few that we know is also a Greek song. And I think it's not sure whether it was first composed as a Sephardic song or taken from a Greek song. But the Greek song is actually very odd. It's the first words of Christ. To proton logum to Christo.
Right, I've heard that before.
Yeah. So that's, as far as I know, that's the story on that.
Yeah. And
Asher,
yes.
if you could please just check your volume. We can still hear you, but it went down a bit.
Okay, is that better, maybe?
I think so.
Yeah, Los Bilbilicos.
There you go.
Yeah, Los Bilbilicos is an interesting case in terms of what maqam it is. It is classified as Hijaz, but depending on what version you play, there are there's that, or so it depends. It depends. There are different modulations that render it differently, but for the sake of tefillah classification, it's Hijaz, yes. And Michael asks something about bakasha. Oh, I see Isaac answered that precisely and correctly. Haim Effendi has a version of Los Bilbilicos. I need to hear that. Yeah, I think that's about it, unless anyone has any other questions specific to this maqam and this bakasha. I think that's about it, and we should say Shabbat Shalom Vorach. Someone asks information on the other maqamat associated with Agadelcha. I know a version in Siga and I know a version in Bayat. I can send those. I'm happy to send anything. And please, people, please feel free to reach out to me, send me emails, ask questions. I can send all of the resources that I have at my disposal can be yours. I'll send you all of the recordings. Yes.
And a preparation together to sing some Turkish music, and maybe one night we can give some different musics together as a concert you will play and I will sing the Turkish version, or I can teach people how to
It would be really fun. Please send me an email and we can prepare something especially for a week where there's a good connection between the musics.
Sure.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for joining Sephardic Heritage International in DC, or SHIN-DC, today. The Maqam of the Week webinar with Asher Shasho-Levy is a weekly class that occurs every Friday through August 28th. So please join us via the same Zoom information each week. The next class is on Friday, July 3rd, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time in the US and Canada. You can also email any questions to Asher between classes at Asher Shasho-Levy, Levy with a Y, at SHIN-DC.org, which is the same as his Instagram. So please also be sure to follow him on there. Please also make sure that you are receiving the emails from us to access class recordings and materials. You should have received a few of those emails already from info@shindc.org, including supplemental videos. This class is really the highlight of my week. SHIN-DC builds intercultural bridges while raising awareness of Sephardic and other underrepresented Jewish heritages and the cultures, arts, and history of the Middle East, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, Greece, the Balkans, and Central and Western Asia. In light of that mission, we treasure the Maqam of the Week webinar series with Asher because it shows us the connections between the Arabic, Persian, and Turkish arts of music and Sephardic music. Further, Asher has also already shown us connections between the Maqam in Syrian Sephardic music and Sephardic music of Greece, the Balkans, and Turkey. The bridges are already there. We don't need to create them. And we invite you to join us as we expand our musical worldview, maqam by maqam, by making those connections with us each week. For anyone who would like to donate to Asher or to SHIN-DC, please contact us at info@shindc.org and we'll tell you how you can do so. Your support helps us to continue providing a program of this quality to the community at no cost. And on that note, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Umeborach. So, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom Meborach, everyone.
And see you next week, Friday, July 3rd, for the next Maqam of the Week webinar with Asher, inshallah.
I thank you all for joining. It really is the highlight of my week, and I just so appreciate it. Shabbat Shalom Meborach, everyone, and inshallah, I'll see you all next week.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Meborach, everyone. Be well, everyone.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Shukran.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
אגדיך אלוהי עולים שמה ויודעך ברוב בחדרי אמה